back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, July 21st, 2016. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. The A-Team is back, and that is very good news because there is a lot to talk about this week in the world of MMA. Consider this, my friends. Since the last time we spoke on this show last Thursday, these are the things that have happened in this sport. Brock Lesnar on Friday was announced he tested positive or failed a pre-fight drug test on June 28th, a mere 9 or so days before UFC 200. That happened on Friday. On Saturday, Evangelista Cyborg Santos suffered a fractured skull in his fight against Michael Venom Page. We got a break on Sunday. Monday morning, we find out that John Jones failed his pre-fight drug test for 2 substances. Both of those were anti-estrogen blockers. That's what we found out from the Nevada Athletic Commission on Monday. On Tuesday, we find out that Brock Lesnar failed a second drug test, this time in competition. Yesterday, we find out that Chad Mendes got a 2-year suspension from USADA. We find out that Emil Meck is out of his debut on September 23rd. And oh, by the way, Jose Aldo claims to have had spies in Frankie Edgar's training room. And if that wasn't enough for you, on Tuesday, UFC President Dana White addressed the nation at the Republican National Convention.
Maybe the worst of all the offenders right
there. That was the last 7 days in the world of MMA. I had to get that off my chest right off the bat. You know that man. That's Luke Thomas of SiriusXM and MMAfighting.com. That is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of the Washington Post. And of course, that is the man in the hat, returning, Chuck Mindenhall of MMAfighting.com. Guys, I go through that. Chuck, you weren't here last week, but that's the last 7 days for us. I mean, those are the highlights. Every single day, it's another piece of news that makes you just want to say, you know, where's the light at the end of the tunnel? When can we just start focusing on fights? When can we start talking about what we love most about this sport, and that's the actual competition between two athletes? So what I want to ask you right off the bat, Luke, is this. How do you feel about the current state of MMA today? Mid-July 2016, with all this going on, it feels like every time we open our phone, open Twitter, there's some sort of statement on a fighter doing this or that. Some sort of news, the UFC sale going on. I mean, there's just so much unknown, so much uncertainty, and frankly, a lot of bad news these days. Where are we at right now in MMA?
I don't feel as gloomy as you do, I guess.
Okay.
We'll get into this, I guess, later, so I won't rush into it now. I don't feel nearly as panicked by the PED stuff. It doesn't bother me very much at all, to be honest.
Tell us why.
Well, this is a bit of a larger conversation.
Sure.
But I believe that the push for USADA and USADA's USADA's doing the job they're being paid to do. Let's sort of be real about that, right? That's fine. I personally, if you're asking me what is the major problem, how do we secure fighter safety and fair competitiveness, I would not really put PEDs the problems at the top of the list. I put it somewhere fairly close to the bottom. To me, here's a perfect example. There have been 13 known deaths in mixed martial arts, 4 during sanctioned events, 9 during not unsanctioned. First of all, that there are more than double in unsanctioned versus sanctioned should tell you a lot. Number 2, of the 4 that were sanctioned, 1 happened at an amateur event. 1 seems to just be a sort of a bad coincidence. Another happened because of improper medical screening, and another one happened on a pro bout, but it was one where it happened right after the end of a suspension without, again, decent proper medical screening. In other words, all of them came from a failure for proper regulation. Not one of them is tied to death. I am tied to PEDs. I am so sick and tired of hearing we have to do something about PEDs or someone's going to die. What a totally bankrupt argument. This is absolute nonsense. There is not a shred of evidence to support it. Yes, PEDs confer benefits, and I'm sure my colleagues will disagree, and that's okay, because I know that I am fairly alone in this position. But when I see fighters testing positive for things, and people will be like, we're going to clean up the sport, you are kidding yourself. They will never stop. They will never stop. There might be somewhat less use over time, but not really substantively less use. And the idea that we're going to send Chad Mendes away for 2 years for what is not really a crime relative to what. Think about what happened to Flow Combat a few weeks ago when that guy held that rear naked choke too long, the referee didn't stop it. That is danger to a fighter. How about if Michael Venom Page had done that, by the way, a clean fighter, had done that to Cyborg and that had been at a place where there wasn't proper regulation? He might have died. The fact that they had proper ambulance protocol at the O2 Arena is what saved him, basically.
Well, does it have to be one or the other? I mean, these are all issues.
It does not, but you're asking me if I'm panicked about it. You're asking me, like, do I really care that John Jones...
No, that's not what I asked you. I asked you, how do you feel about the current state? There's a lot of big things happening right now.
Yeah,
I mean,
but the PED failures to me...
doesn't bother you. It doesn't deter you.
It does. I'm not going to say, like, I love it.
Sure,
but
of course.
it's like, to me, this is... The only reason you don't see those headlines in the NBA or the NFL or anyone is because their drug testing programs are not as strict. It's not because those guys are not doing it. And the argument that we have to do an MMA because you're hitting someone's face and not a ball is absolutely bankrupt and has no relevancy whatsoever. And I do have some issues. You know, Mark Hunt's out there being very concerned, talking about Fighters Association, and there is the William Morris Endeavor, sorry for the long answer. Uncertainty, but even then, I don't feel particularly all that bad about it.
Fair enough. What do you think?
Well, to respond to Luke, I mean, rather than taking the topic, I mean, I will say that I don't think that it is a completely bankrupt argument to run that comparison between hitting a ball and hitting somebody. I mean, we've seen during baseball's steroid era, we saw guys hitting home runs that were just moonshots.
Sure.
And of course, that's happened all through the history of sports, but it was happening even more so during that era. And if you just transfer that, there is certainly some advantage or let's say enhancement in the amount of power that you can generate. So there certainly is something to be said for. There's a good reason to have steroids and other performance-enhancing substances banned. I think that's a good thing. But I will agree with you to the point of saying that I don't think that it's as this is not some kind of dire circumstance that we're presenting it as. I mean, these fighters are. It seems to me that some of the fighters now who are popping are popping because of ignorance. They just don't understand what it is that's in these supplements that they take. You could certainly argue that these things are enhancing them and that that's wrong and they're breaking the rules, and I'm not going to disagree with that. But I will agree with Luke that it's not as dire a circumstance. I will say this: your general question. What's the state? I think MMA and the UFC in particular is in a state of transition in all things. It's a brand new owner, so that's a transition, and this PED discussion is really at the early stages. They haven't quite figured out how to make it work within the context of having fights actually go on as planned.
Yeah, I mean, the PED thing aside, I mean, that you look at that, if you start with that, I always wonder, like, how do people from the outside, within the bubble, we've been seeing this for a long time. We sort of knew that this was going to be the case. The truest words were by Lorenzo Fertitta, right? This thing's going to get worse before it gets better. Well, I guess we're in the worst. That's what's going on. They're going to catch these.
You would hope, right?
You would hope.
Get worse. It could always get worse.
That's true. It just so happens that this coincides with the biggest event of the year. It's UFC 200, so this would be like the Super Bowl, but beyond that, maybe it'd be more like the Olympics or something, because it's once every 6 years or whatever it is when you get to these big round numbers. And you get the two biggest stars that are on this card, basically the guys who are under that scrutiny. To the outside, this just looks like what a farce this league has become. You know what I'm saying? That bothers me. That's the stuff that bothers me. It's just really the perception of a sport that for so long we've tried to push into that mainstream, not at least more into a more enlightened area about everything that's going on in the sport, to have it kind of revert back into that discussion and actually become bigger scrutiny on everybody and generalizations and all that sort of thing. I mean, that bothers me. You know what I mean? Like, that's the stuff. But basically, in terms of the whole state of where we're at, it feels weird to me right now, man. It's like it's like the winds of change, the uncertainty you were mentioning with the new ownership. There's so much going on all at once. Not just in that, but just in we talked.
You feel nervous?
Somewhat. I wouldn't say nervous. I just feel very
uneasy,
unrooted. Like you're just not sure where it's headed, what's going on, because even just I saw Marco Money had a piece today. They're finally looking more at the judging aspects. They're going to vote on that. There are things within the fundamentals of the game that are changing. The weigh-in process. Yeah. There's all these things all at once, like this crucible of the moment in the MMA. Where are we headed? Where is it going? And where are we at? But then you compound it with sort of all these little things that are going on within it, and I can't say it's gloomy, but it certainly is weird and listless. I feel like I'm not sure exactly where everything's heading.
When your biggest entity within the sport has just been sold for $4 billion, and we talked about this last week a little bit, how we always talk about, well, when is the UFC, when is MMA going to enter the mainstream? And clearly it has entered the mainstream when you're able to sell something for $4 billion. So that's part of the transition there would seem to be in a good way. Now, I know that the MMA, the PED stuff we're talking about is very unsettled. But they've taken some steps forward. They just haven't quite figured out what those steps. They haven't taken those steps to their logical conclusion. You know, you have John Jones and Brock Lesnar. John Jones got popped for a PED and didn't get to fight. That's what's supposed to happen. Lesnar popped and did get to fight. That's not supposed to happen. So they have to kind of figure out how to make these things. If you're going to test for PEDs, do it in such a way that it's not just a matter of, well, we're going to let this guy's going to compete, then we're going to negate his victory and we're going to ban him for. That's not the way it should be. If you're going to do this, you have to make it so that somebody cannot compete if they pop. If they violate your rules.
Yeah.
That's the way they've got to figure out whether they expedite the results or whatever it is they do. They've got to do that. I mean, there are bigger issues as well, but that's the bottom line.
Real quick, a couple of points about both the point he raised. Real quickly, actually, is.
Sure.
If you look at the NFL, what's the NFL doing this offseason? Right, they're going to put microchips in the uprights because they're going to consider whether they want to narrow the goalposts. Now, this is a small thing. It's akin to, let's say, the rule changes that ABC might consider. But they do those kinds of things every single offseason. Do we kick off from the 35? Do we want to get rid of special teams altogether? What are some other rules we want to have? In other words, they make the truth about the NFL, and actually part of its genius, is that it's always changing. It's always updated. They may not be adding new teams or getting new owners all the time, and that's a more substantive change. But for the game itself, the fans are constantly kind of kept on their toes a little bit. And I think what we're doing is all these changes at once.
Yeah.
And so it feels, and of course the $4 billion is a big thing, of course. But in terms of like the PED thing, just to be clear about this, like this is very much a UFC created problem. They panicked. It was a moral panic when everything went down all at once, most particularly with Anderson Silva, and they brought this along themselves. If they're upset about bad headlines, the only people they have to look at is the mirror, because the other leagues realize that they can do things in-house and basically still keep the integrity of their sports. And everyone's like, well, what about the safety of the fighters? Again, I mean, you don't get to have it both ways. You do not get to have an organization like Pride or commission testing UFC era, and you can't brag that you had no death or serious injury and then come forward and say we had to do something because there was going to be a death or serious injury. Certainly, it is a plausible idea that someone on something could do something bad. As it turns out, that hasn't happened actually yet. And what has happened is guys getting really badly hurt because of improper officiating or some kind of lack of regulatory oversight. That, to me, is the much bigger issue.
Is it possible that it is impossible to quantify the dangers of using PEDs in MMA right now? So yeah, you can say no one's gotten seriously hurt, no one's hurt his opponent, but what happens in 5 years? What happens in 10 years? I know in the world of pro wrestling, there has been an unbelievable amount of wrestlers who have died around the age of 45, and that's due to a whole number of things, but that's not tied
to anabolic steroids. It is very loosely correlated with anabolic steroids.
No, I mean, you can't tie them all, but
there are no anabolic studies in adults because most trial boards won't approve it, but there are studies in children, and of course it's terrible for them.
Sure, in a previous life, I was an intern at HBO Sports, and Real Sports did a story on this very topic.
Yeah.
Early deaths of professional wrestlers. People like Roddy Piper, who has since passed away, talked openly about the mix of being on the road, using cocaine, using steroids, this concoction.
It's a terrible life. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So what I'm asking is, we're starting to see the sport grow up. We don't really know the damage that Mark Hunt took in that fight as a result of what Brock Lesnar may have been on.
He took a lot more in the Stipe Miocic fight from a clean fighter.
Fair enough, but to me,
markedly more.
To me, the thing to say like this isn't a problem and to just brush it aside just because.
I'm not brushing it aside, but like everyone's like, oh my God,
you can't trump it.
I'm like these PED headlines. I'm like, so what?
You don't think it's a bad look for the sport? This is not.
This is a self-imposed.
This is not Gleison Tebow testing positive. This is John Jones, the greatest of all time. This is Brock Lesnar. This is Frank Mir. This is Chad Mendes. These are big names.
I'm not denying it's not a bad PR look, but what you're asking me for is the facts. And the facts are that as a relative danger to the sport, we have a ridiculously outsized boogeyman version of the truth. It is not the truth that apparently PEDs helped Chad Mendes. We don't even know if he took it during those other fights. We just know he was sort of on it now. And all I'm trying to sort of get across to you is I understand the UFC has to do something. Like, for example, Jonathan Snowden was asking, like, why does the WWE have a wellness policy? And I am no WWE expert, Jeff. I know you are. But basically, it's to cover your ass in the event that there is some kind of legal issue. But testing as such, as we present it to the world, look how much testing we're doing. That is for low information donks to enjoy the veneer that they're enjoying a clean sport. Here's the truth. There has never been a clean sport. Here's the truth. The sport isn't clean now. And here's some further truth. It's never going to be clean.
So why did they do it? Why did they partner with USADA?
Because
they panic?
Because PED moral panic is an absolutely real phenomenon.
You really think they caved just to that?
Yeah.
Do you think that it's possible
Do you
that
think they were really worried that someone was going to die as a consequence of this?
No. But do you think it's possible that they were hopeful to sell the company and said, look, this will
Oh,
be
sure.
good.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I could believe that, sure.
So do you think, okay, so right now when we look at the headlines and all this stuff, you're saying your reaction to this is Jon Jones being out, Brock Lesnar being out, Chad Mendes being out. This was going to happen perhaps regardless. This is not that big a deal. There are other things that we should be worried about more. Is it fair?
My thought is that there's probably a real possibility that, I don't know how you guys feel about this. I think the new owners might bring testing in-house at some point.
Get rid of USADA.
Yeah, they might bring it in-house.
Talk about a bad PR move there when you did it in the first place for a PR
Yeah,
move
it would
and
be.
then take it away.
What's that? Worse, or you keep having. Look,
Sure.
if you did,
Well, you're shooting yourself in the foot.
The major sports all do that stuff in-house. I mean, other than the Olympics, basically all the NFL, baseball, they all do they're pretty much in charge of their PED issues.
and no one cares.
Okay, let me ask you about this. The relationship is real between the UFC and USADA. So let's just forget about the hysteria and whatever. How do you think it's going? I know you just touched on this briefly, but do you feel like it's going as well as you thought it would? Less good? Is it kind of as you thought it was going to go? I mean, honestly, you mentioned that Lorenzo Fertitta. Did we think it was going to affect the Jon Joneses 3 days before the 200? The Brock Lesnar. Like, is this the way you thought it was going to go? Do you think USADA is doing better? What do you think about the relationship right now?
I think it's complicated because there's always the idea. Well, if the UFC is bringing somebody in, they're going to cater to the UFC. Obviously, this is not the case. USADA ruined their UFC 200 main event with the Jon Jones fight. So, and there are other things where they're losing stars. So clearly, it gives the UFC the ability to step back and say, "See, we are doing something. We're stepping out of this and letting them take care of it." The same way that Dana White always say, "Well, we're regulated by the government." We knew that was kind of silly because the state commissions were not, at least Nevada, was not really doing things all that well. But USADA, we could say, is doing it more thoroughly. So I think that's a good thing, but I do think that they still have to get this thing right. If you're going to be testing people, you can't be testing people and then a few days after they've competed, say, "Oh well, that we're going to just turn that into a no contest and that guy's going to be banned going forward." You can't do that. If you're going to be testing, I know that they have expedited testing available. I don't know the exact time it would take, but certainly if the guy is tested on, June 28th, and the fight is July 9th, there has to be an ability to get those results in sooner rather than later. So I think that if we were going to give a grade to USADA, I would give it an incomplete because that's what I feel like. They haven't delivered the results the way they need to deliver them. They've gotten the big headlines. Jon Jones is out. Brock Lesnar pops. But it has to be more results like the Jon Jones one and less like the Brock Lesnar one.
You know, it's an interesting thing. People have been talking about, as you mentioned, I think it's very dangerous to imply that the UFC knew that Brock Lesnar tested positive on June 28th and let him fight. I do not believe that for 1 second. Right. I think the Jon Jones thing squashes all that conspiracy. I do not think that they would allow someone knowing. I mean, maybe I'm naive, but I think that's a very dangerous accusation and a very reckless one. But here's something that's worth noting when we're talking about expediting tests. Brock Lesnar's test happened on June 28th, right? The first one that he failed. The results came back to us on July the 15th. I believe the UFC got the results on July 14th. So that's 16 or so days, correct? Mm-hmm. His second test that he failed was July 9th, the day of the fight. We got those results back July 19th, 10 days later. If they would have gotten the results back for the June 28th fight 10 days after, the June 28th test, 10 days after it happened, that would have been July 8th, the day before UFC 200. So why were they able to get the second test back 10 days after? You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So Mark, basically my point is, to you, Chuck, Mark Hunt is a pretty pissed off guy right now. Does he have a leg to stand on? by the policy, he's not getting any money. He's asking for a full purse or a release.
It's good for him to say that, at least.
It is good, but how do they rectify this with Mark Hunt, a guy who, by the way, as of last night, said no one from the UFC has even reached out to him via phone to discuss this? How do they fix this?
Start by calling him, at least.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, to me, that's one of the most egregious parts of the story. Is just like he's having to sort of catch everything as it's happening elsewhere and catch the news and see things move without them even contacting him. He's got a right to be upset, man. I mean, I read his statements, like talking to you and otherwise, even the one he made on especially the one he made on his own site. But you gotta sympathize with the guy. His last 3 opponents have all been, Mir, and even Bigfoot before that. It wasn't that fight, but he had been popped in that big fight that happened in Australia. I just, the guy he's got a legitimate gripe. It's almost like the Michael Bisping thing, where you're like, well, every guy I face has been, juicing, and I think he feels like the UFC was complicit in that whole 4-month exemption kind of leading up and all of that. It's hard to dispute some of the things he's saying, and I think that, just broadening it again, and his whole thing he's talking about. I mean, this specter of $4 billion is going to change a lot of people. I mean, the roster is comprised of what? A bunch of mercenaries and bounty hunters and guys who are in the prize fighting game. And then all of a sudden they see a figure like this. You know what I mean? They're going to start looking at the holes in their shoes a little bit and saying like, hey, where's my piece of that? Why aren't I getting more of that? And I feel like Mark Hunt is one of those guys, even though I think he got like $700,000 disclosed purse, which by other standards might have been pretty good money for that, but not at UFC 200 in a spot against Brock Lesnar and everything else. So I just feel like he's on to something on all of it. It'd be really interesting to see if how much. I mean, I don't really truly believe we're going to get an association out of it, what he's asking.
He's saying our blood is lined in their pockets. I mean, he's putting out some pretty powerful statements, and he's saying, I want everyone to come together and to each.
Yeah.
And so we've now gone from, we've been talking about this association stuff forever, and it just kind of, it dies.
It never dies. That's the thing. It never grows, but it never dies.
But here's the interesting thing. It went from like the disgruntled ex-UFC fighter, the Nate Quarry who's out of the UFC, the Kung Lee who's out, the Randy Couture, to the Leslie Smith, who's sort of on the fringe but in the UFC, to the TJ Dillashaw last week, to the Mark Hunt. It definitely feels as of late like we're climbing the ladder as far as superstardom is concerned. Do you not agree? This is happening a lot quicker than I thought.
No, I agree, and I think it's all for the reasons we were just talking about. I really believe you suddenly see something behind the curtain like that, like a big acquisition like this, that $4 billion, and it just starts to, you're in the prize fighting game, and you start to examine your own self-worth and everything that goes into that, like the employee versus the independent contractor things, like he was talking about, TJ Dillashaw.
Yeah.
Just, they expect us to wear Reebok gear. It's not like they voted on this or something. They were just expected to accept this tier system of Reebok and everything that was going to happen. USADA, this was something that was imposed. It's like he's basically saying our freedoms are taken away of that of an employee. We're adhering to basically everything that they're doing as employees, essentially, but they're independent contractors. I mean, all of that scrutiny gets bigger and bigger with each thing that goes on. But I really believe that the sale and the winds of change really play over that the most. Just that figure being out there.
Fighters also have to have a look in the mirror too, right? Because you can look at USADA, you could say, I'm for testing, and I get that the UFC has to have a modicum of testing out there. They can't just be like, you can take whatever you want.
Sure.
That does not work, clearly. If for no other reason than legal liability and then, of course, for PR purposes. So I'm not advocating that. But what it would say is, folks should reconsider what USADA's relationship to the fighters is, because they handed down these rules, and I was looking over them last night. I'm still in the research phase of this. I don't know how much it varies organization to organization, from USA weightlifting to track and field to the UFC, but I've noticed some differences in the way in which some of the athletes enjoy due process about who pays for arbitration and how many people you can have on a panel. This just got handed to these guys, and they were like, yeah, we want to get rid of cheaters in the sport. Again, part of the moral panic that had no business happening. And then now all of a sudden, Mark Hunt's like, I want half of his purse. By what right do you claim this? I want to be released if I can't get half of his purse. By what right do you claim this? You guys all cheerleaded when they shoved these rules down your throat, and now you're like, gee, some of this is unfair. To a point, we had this gymnast yesterday, I believe, today's the day, 21st, maybe a week ago. It was revealed that she took tap water and tested positive. The USADA did not give her a potential violation in public. They didn't announce it until it was already solved. And moreover, it's like, look, I get there's a difference between turning on your faucet and then chucking some supplement in the back of your gullet. However, if you're going to say you can take tap water and then you're okay, you are already beginning to poke holes in the you are responsible for whatever you put in your body at all times argument. Clearly, there are some moments where that's not true. So my whole point is like, guys, if you're upset, I understand it, but you cheerleaded it when they pushed it through the door and you didn't say a thing.
Well, I'll go one step further. I think that a lot of their managers failed them because, look, at the end of the day, that's why they have managers, right? I mean, these are fighters. Perhaps they're not looking at this stuff. They don't have the patience to look at this stuff. They just went ahead and signed all of this, and now it's hitting them. Wait a second, Reebok, where are those checks? Where's all that money that I was told? Where are all these royalties that I was told was coming my way? USADA, okay, it's nice to be, to be in this cleaned up sport, but do I really want to tell someone where I am 24 hours a day? And do I really want to get no money if I fight a guy who, beat me up and was on PEDs? I really think, I've said this 1,000 times, I never really thought it would get to this. I feel like we're in 1920s football right now. We're wearing leather helmets. We have no idea what's going on.
Really
and in
true.
20, 30 years, we're going to look back and say, what the hell were we doing?
Well, you've been saying that for a while, and I feel like we're at the moment
It's
now
crazy,
where I feel
right?
like that's crystal clear to me.
Also because of the issues you guys raised, that they are mainstream more now than ever, that it was a $4 billion price tag, largest sale in the history of sports properties, juxtaposed with, these the seemingly futuristic or at least progressive testing regimen relative to other sports, but in no way is it formulated, and some guys get pulled and some guys don't, and we notify you ahead of time. Oh, I'm sorry, you only took supplements, our bad. 6 months, see you out the door. It's really this contrast of opposites that makes for a very confused experience.
It feels like a volcano about to explode.
Well, I was also going to say that the sale took the UFC from being kind of like the family. The Fertittas were not just the owners of the organization, but there was a kind of relationship. You always saw Lorenzo Fertitta at the fights, and seemed to have a relationship with a lot of fighters. And so all the things that fighters might have thought were not quite fair, they might not have wanted to get up there and fight against the guy who's they have some kind of relationship with. Now you've got this kind of impersonal corporate. Not to say that in reality it's all that much different from what it was and what it will be, but there's certainly a different kind of image. And now it's like, well, now we've got these people who paid $4 billion for this. Let's get our piece of the pie. And I don't think that, to your point about managers, I mean, it's great to have a manager to represent your interests, but every single manager working independently is not going to get they're not going to get as much done as a unified front.
Sports Business Journal came out with a fascinating article this week on the sale and some tremendous reporting. John Orand and I believe Michael Smith.
Correct.
Just fascinating stuff about who was interested, who potentially put a bit, just amazing stuff. If you haven't read it, I do suggest reading it. And the big takeaway for me was that, okay, this $4 billion number is a massive number, but what the now soon-to-be former UFC owners were banking on was that the next round of TV deals are going to be very lucrative. Right now, the Sports Business Journal reported that the deal is currently around $110 million from Fox per year, and they're banking on the $400 million ballpark. And again, we've seen what happened in the NBA recently, where the TV deal trickled down to the players. They get 50%, and the salary cap has just exploded. And so when you see that, and this is coming up and all this is happening, do you think by the time the new TV deal comes into play, the negotiations, will there be some sort of association in play to where the fighters will get a piece of this pie? Because as it stands right now, they got 0% of the TV deal.
You tweeted something about this, didn't you? About
They have until 2018.
Yeah.
Basically.
I don't know. It seems like there's enough want out there from these different parts to get something like this. And it certainly helps to see something like the NBA. What's going on in the NBA? All of a sudden, Mozgov's getting $60 million a year. You're like, well, I'm just a journeyman here in the UFC. I should be getting, But you would hope that thought is there. I feel like there's every incentive at this point for those guys to at least talk and start to figure something out. Because, I mean, at this point, the rights and everything that kind of, going back to the whole John Fitch, everything that has sort of happened, I think you have to look at it as a whole and say, like, how are we going to present a unified, how are we going to fit into that landscape? How are we going to benefit from when that day comes? You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, you would hope that at this point, I would hope by 2018 that the guys would come together on some level, even if it's not 100% official, but at least they're in the talking stage.
I mean, you did lay out earlier on the progression we've seen with the former UFC fighters speaking up, and now we're getting people who are an ex-champion, a former, and still a contender in Dillashaw. So we've seen a progression or an elevation in the level of fighter, and perhaps some others will start to talk as well. Really, that's what has to happen. I mean, you can have the rank and file employees or contractors all on board, but if you don't have your star power, you need to, the NBA Players Association has to serve LeBron James just like it has to serve the 12th guy on the worst team in the league. It has to be able to serve all those different things. And I know that those guys often have different interests, very different interests, just like in the UFC, but they still have to do it.
Don't you feel like a lot of these fighters, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the Ali Act, all these things that are kind of in play, and people talking about from political, some people trying to galvanize action through the politics and everything else. I feel like a lot of these fighters really just still have no idea what any of that's about. Like, you know what I'm saying? And I feel like that's what's finally happening. There's a thawing on, like, what does all this mean? People are actually looking into it more and understanding why it's important to try to band together as these major changes.
That's why you have representation, right?
Exactly.
To guide you through that.
I mean, look, no one reads the Ali Act articles that anybody writes. As a guy who's written one, I can tell you that no one reads them.
Yeah.
But they'll read the $4 billion sale one. That one will catch their eyeballs.
But I bet you that they don't read it as much as Conor McGregor says, I'm going to knock Nate Diaz's head off.
Everyone loves those. But just to do the math here, so if they make 110, 115 million right now, fighters get zero of that, okay? So let's just, there's the article, by the way, that showed that the television networks expressed some skepticism that the UFC would be getting 400 million TV rights annually. But okay, let's say that they do. Sure. Let's say that they do, right? If they had the current NBA deal, they would get roughly, each year, the fighters would get $200 million more in pay. Divide that by 500, what is that? 400,000 each extra?
40,000.
No, more than that. 500 times 40,000? It's 400.
Jeff, you're the smart one.
Let me think.
What is it? My math is terrible.
Let me take my shoes
Oh,
off.
yes, you're right.
It's 400,000.
You're right.
Minimum, on average, each one would get 400,000 more each year just in a bump. Forget what your contract already says. Well, you get the idea.
It's a lot of money.
It's an S ton of money extra on top of whatever else you could get from. Remember, they still don't get any money off the video game or whatever they sign when they show up
in the UFC if that happens.
And they're gonna risk pissing that away.
Yeah.
Yes, they are.
What surprises me though is people are like, oh, the UFC sold for $4 billion. This is going to lead to all this change. Do we really think that the new owners are going to come in and be like, we just spent all this money, now we're going to start giving you a piece of this pie, that pie, that?
Not.
It's actually, it feels like it's the opposite. They're going to try to get that money back.
They need to be persuaded to do
that. That's what's hard to contemplate is, we want to get a return on our investment. How does that change things if it doesn't seem like it's working out right away? You know what I mean? Like, we see so many curveballs in the sport. We see so many PR disasters in the sport, everything that comes up. It seems very risky when you're thinking about all, them coming in and putting that much money and how they might get that back. Besides just TV, like in just in general, how to grow the sport from here. It's a weird time for them to take it over. So that's really the looming thing, right? Like, is what happens? What happens? Are they going to start reining in? Like, Dana's not really been out there as much, but he was a liability for a while in a lot of ways because he was creating bad headlines. Well, we haven't seen him out there doing that as much, but are they going to let him be himself? Is he going to be the same guy? You know what I mean? There's going to be a lot of things that are going to play out over the next few years.
Go ahead.
Look at the difference in ownership now. What was the biggest obstacle to the UFC and MMA in general being sanctioned here in the state of New York? It was a battle with a union, right? And where does that come from? It derives back to the Fertitas business back in Nevada, where they ran the biggest non-union casino business out there. So they have a lot of experience at making sure that unions don't infiltrate their business, or at least don't interfere with the kind of business they want to run. They're not in the picture anymore. Now we've got a whole different entity, which I'm sure has smart people who are going to also try to dissuade fighters, but they don't have the same kind of background in this that the Fertitas do. And so, I think that the tides are going to change.
I will say that obviously William Morris makes stars, sustained stars. They know what they're doing on that front. Sure. And this sport, we go back to last year at this time, we had Ronda Rousey riding about as high as she's going to get, and Conor McGregor. So you had both these stars. I think that's part of it. You're like, well, if we can build stars and we can get to this point where, we have more than just one or two that are transcendent in the sport, but we have a stable of guys, a good number of those types. those individual stars become very lucrative, like as they go forward. But
Though spare me the talk that, oh, we're going to make movie stars and blah, blah, blah. I mean, how many times do we have to hear this? MMA fighters aren't movie stars. I mean, look at the biggest names. They've tried. Most of them have failed.
There's a lot of straight to DVD movies that would tell you otherwise.
It's just like, this is the same thing that we heard from Viacom when they bought Bellator. We hear this over and over again that we're going to turn them into movie stars and more Hollywood opportunities.
Yeah, for a few they're going to.
Yeah, then they're going to dub.
Krasinski's pretty good.
Next thing you know, they'll dub your voice in your big movie premiere, right? Like they did to Gina Carano. Poor Gina. Let me ask you two things that I think really need to change ASAP as far as USADA goes. One is the one that you mentioned. If you're going to go through the trouble of doing pre-fight drug testing and actually use the resources to go out and find these guys all over the world, you got to get the results back before, especially if it's multiple days before. If it's the night of the fight, I get it. You're not going to get the results that night, but you just can't. It's just you have to figure it out. Whether it's paying more, devoting a single lab to it. Don't tell me it's impossible. It's possible. If you're going to do it, get the freaking results before. And I mean, do we disagree with this?
I agree with you.
That's the way the program's designed to run. Yes.
It should, yeah. And the second one is, I mean, if we're going to go ahead and put out these provisional suspensions, you need to tell us right off the bat what it's for. It's like a public person getting arrested, and the cop saying Joe Schmo has gotten arrested, last night in Hollywood, and that's it. Well, what did he get arrested for? DWI, battery, rape, robbery, murder. What did he get arrested for? We know. Now, that's not saying he's guilty before proven innocent, but you can't just tell us that Chad Mendes or better yet, Brock Lesnar or John Jones is out of UFC 200 and not tell us why. I think that's unfair to the fighter. It leads to speculation. It leads to unfair criticism. Look what happened to Yoel Romero. I really can't understand why they're okay with announcing it at the end of the entire process, but in the interest of fairness to the fighter, why they won't just announce it right off the bat. Doesn't make sense to me.
Well, a fighter does have the right to announce it him or herself.
Yeah, and how often are they doing that?
Well, but you're saying it's not fair to the fighter. The fighter can take the.
USADA's the one breaking the news. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? It's not the fighter breaking the news. I'm sure they wouldn't want to break the news themselves, right?
Yeah, we're going to tell everyone you're a terrible lout. Well, we just won't say what for. We'll give you the dignity.
It's also going to come out one way or another. So
well,
why?
You think, but look, the Brock thing, you have inhaler talk, you have this and that. Let me ask you about Chad Mendes then. Chad Mendes gets 2 years. Same punishment that, John Jones will get if he is found completely guilty. Is it fair to suspend a guy for the same amount as the other guy who was just about to fight and this was found in his system, as opposed to the guy who was in between training camps and not prepared to fight? Should it be a case by case as opposed to one swooping 2-year punishment for your first offense? Is that fair?
I'm always afraid of these case by case things, even though they are often the most intelligent way of adjudicating adjudicating, I should say, the situation. I made up a new word.
I educate all the time.
Yeah, how about that? I'd be more educated if I didn't educate. I get a little bit worried about the case-by-case thing because I see often these things end up being grandstanding and they're not always dealt with as fairly as they should be. So sometimes this kind of mandatory sentencing idea does work, but I do agree with you that there are different circumstances, and I wish that there was a more nuanced system that said if you are on the cusp of a fight and you test positive, that is a bigger offense than if you were just in the middle of a camp.
So Frank Mir said recently that he would like to be released from his UFC contract because he can't make any money right now. He's out for 2 years. They won't hire him as a broadcaster. He has 4 kids. Let me go off and do my thing. I'm not going to fight this. They have yet to grant that release. Mirko Cro Cop was released last week. UFC telling our own Mark Raimondi that they did grant him a release, and now he's a part of Rizin. He's in Japan. He's fighting in this crazy open-weight Grand Prix, which is very nostalgic for all the old Pride fans. Do you guys like the fact that the UFC released Cro Cop, and should they release Frank Mir? Good soldier, former champion, relatively good ambassador for the sport. Should they be open to this idea of, all right, we're not going to keep you on the sidelines, and maybe we can revisit this in 2 years, but here you go out there and make money? Or should they keep him on the sidelines? What do you think?
They keep him on the sidelines if they're going to use him. I don't really feel like if you have no use for a guy and he can't fight, it's not like he can just go to Bellator. Well, I guess he could.
He could go to Bellator, yeah.
So there is that risk. But even then, you're just going to imprison a guy because he might go to a competitor on Spike. That seems awfully spiteful.
But it's looking at the other side. The guy did it to himself, right? Let's just say you failed.
Allegedly.
Yeah, no, I'm saying, let's say you fail the test and you say, okay, I'm not going to fight this, but I want to go out and make money. Should the UFC say, all right, see you later, and now run the risk of you going to fight for the competition?
I mean, look, I'm not the UFC. This is a very difficult question for me to answer. Certainly you could say, no, they shouldn't, right? They should keep control of their assets. They should never let a competitor get something like this. If you're asking me from the humanitarian angle, I would like to see Frank Mir released.
Yeah.
I don't know that he would go to Bellator. Maybe he would. Maybe they would give him an offer he couldn't refuse. But I always thought he was really good at the WEC commentary. And when he made that unfortunate remark about, I hope Lesnar dies, which I was like, maybe you don't say that. And he got pulled, and I thought that was really a shame. He's one of the better commentators that MMA's ever had. So if he could find a gig, that'd be great. But it's just an impossible question for me to answer because I have wildly different priorities than what the UFC does, and it's hard for me to put myself in their shoes.
Okay, okay, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, with Cro Cop particularly, he's 41 years old.
Yeah.
The guy's, he had the shoulder thing. This is the reason. Remember, he was talking about why he was doing what he was doing. Like you said, what is the use for him? I'm not sure that the UFC was going to have actual use for him by the time he's ready to come back, if he's ever going to come back. And this guy, he's probably, I look at Cro Cop, I look at that and it's like, it's a return to Japan. He can do it, the great amnesty Japan. Like, you can go there and no consequence whatsoever. And I feel like he just was like, I just want to make one or two, a couple more paychecks before I'm done, and that makes sense. But as far as I don't know exactly how old Frank Mir is. I know none of these guys.
39?
But it's like, obviously he does represent, I think, more to the company than Cro Cop does at this point. So you could see where they'd be more hesitant to let a guy like him go, who could feasibly be an asset to somebody like Bellator on a number of levels. So like Matt Mitrione doing the kickboxing and everything else, you could see how he might want to do, like, parlay that into a gig where he's in the spotlight, and how they might be resilient on that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't think that there's an obligation on the UFC's part. I mean, obviously Frank Mir signed a contract and he has to fulfill that. But I do think, one thing, I don't have a big issue with him even participating in some of the programming. I mean, I recognize that there's some PR things to deal with.
Yeah.
I mean, look, not everybody's perfect. I don't think that I don't think you need to necessarily just pull him out and pretend he doesn't exist anymore and then hold on to his contract and hide him in a closet somewhere. I feel like that it would be a goodwill gesture to let him go. It would also be a goodwill gesture to say, well, we're still going to use you. We're going to use you on Fight Pass for this or that or something. I don't mean fighting. Obviously, you can't fight, but for commentating or doing instructional things, or there are a lot of different things they could use him for. And why not use him? Why not consider him an asset as opposed to just saying, well, you're an asset, so we're going to hide you away? Why not use the guy?
Also, like, Cro Cop, I don't know what he did in terms of, like, getting them to do this, but he may have been like, hey, look, guys, here's a rising contract. If you just let me roll, I'm just going to sign this. They're like, we don't care about that.
Yeah.
Versus Mir's like, I promise not to go to Bellator. Right. And then Bellator just sort of waits their time. He gets released.
All of a sudden, Frank Mir's rolling up at the Dave & Buster's.
Yeah, they're backing up the Dave & Buster's trucks to let out the foosball tables and everything else. So it's a bit riskier. I mean, it just, to me, on a humanitarian angle, the guy's got kids, for crying out loud. Like, just to be like, you have to go be a beat cop now? I don't know about that.
Sets an interesting precedent, though, because he can now say, look, you just released Mirko Cro Cop. Why aren't you releasing me? And then what happens if John Jones says, look, you just released those guys?
This is another thing that if they had contractual provisions, they could figure this out.
Yeah, right.
Jose Aldo told the Brazilian media yesterday.
This is the all-time weirdest story ever.
Jose Aldo told the Brazilian media yesterday that he had people in Frankie Edgar's training room. Now, important to say, not his team, in his training room. So if you don't know, come fight week, the fighters are training in these rooms that the UFC sets up for them, but there's a list of names. So it's like, okay, blue corner can go there, red corner, and there's at least 8 or so fighters competing on the card assigned to these rooms. Now, they're not there all day, every day at the same time, but people are coming and going. And Aldo just kind of comes out and tells the media that, yeah, I had someone there, spies, as he said, looking at what Frankie was doing and then reporting back to me, and that's why I didn't do this, this, and that, and did do this, this, and that in my fight. Is this mind games? When you hear this, after the fact, he wins the fight, is this mind games on Aldo's part? Is he taking a page out of McGregor's book, who claimed before their second fight that he had a spy within his camp? Should Frankie Edgar be livid? Does this now crumble a team? What's your reaction to this story? Why don't you go ahead?
I read that and I was just like, oh God, help me, please. We've got Brock Lesnar taking estrogen blockers, and now Jose Aldo talking about moles and
Openly just coming out with it, just like nonchalantly.
That's the surprising part.
Yeah, he's like, of course. He's like, of course.
So my attitude was basically like, look, did he probably maybe have someone who strolled through and was looking around? Sure, but like the way in which Aldo fought for 25 minutes was clearly that was a well-schooled, prepared fighter who was acting on a number of premises.
I mean, he didn't just figure that out the last 3 days before the fight when he said one of his.
Now he is a genius, but not that kind of genius. So to me, it's like, is it a plausible scenario that he sent that and that could be like a technically kind of true thing? Sure, but like the level at which these guys fight, it's like. They can't. I don't know how to explain it exactly. You can't just switch on a dime. I mean, like that. You have to be extraordinarily well prepared. And he didn't throw kicks at all from the beginning. You know, it's to me was he was prepared not to throw kicks.
You know, the world of Bill Belichick, it's not about spying on the opponent that you're coming up with right now. It's about planting the seed of doubt in every future opponent, so that after, you know, in the NFL, the big Spygate thing happened. That wasn't about beating the Jets. I mean, they could beat the Jets with their hand tied behind their back. It's about every single opponent after that worrying about what were they going to do. And this was not about
Frankie
then
why
Edgar.
say it?
This
Why
was not
say
about,
it?
This was about Conor McGregor. It was just one more thing trying to get into, like, make Conor McGregor think about something.
Okay, but then why say it? Because now what happens is anyone who fights Jose Aldo will say, oh, you're Brazilian, you over there, manager of some guy that I've never seen, you're not allowed in this room.
Because it's not about actually getting information. It's about having the McGregor camp looking over at every single Brazilian dude. Every time I go to, like, you know, go out and get some Brazilian barbecue, and, you know, they're going to be like wondering about what somebody is going to report back to Jose. It's just like another bit of mind games. That's all.
If it is, I give him credit for having those happen. I mean, that's some real foresight to be like, I'm going to start infecting the McGregor camp right now with where our potential is. But if you go back to, I think was it UFC 156 when they first met, Edgar? If I recall that fight, and I haven't watched that fight recently, but I seem to recall there was a lot of kicks, and Edgar was catching a lot of them. It was like there were the moments where it got a little interesting when they catch a kick and sort of try to take him down. To me, that was just, you're looking at a guy who made an adjustment from the first fight. That's all that seemed to me. Like, this was a guy who was not going to, you know, make himself vulnerable to that type of game plan, knowing that probably that's what Frankie Edgar had up his sleeve. That's what they do. So in my mind, I was like, I agree with you. I thought his execution was so sublime that night and honed in. Like, that was what he wanted to do the whole way. So I do feel like it's some kind of mind games. Who knows why Jose Aldo? There's many things he's been saying over the last year that you have to kind of contemplate. Why is he saying that? You know. So I just feel like this is the next one.
He's a fascinating guy.
Also, like when those guys are warming up, they're doing things they practiced in training camp, but they're also just warming up all the different muscles, doing a couple arm bars from the guard.
Well, that's in the locker room before, but like on a Wednesday afternoon, they're going through game plan.
Yeah, I understand, but like, did he really think that? If he had never had that, would he have been unable to make those calculations? It seems to be like, for example, I'll give credit where credit is due. Jack Slack had wrote an article before the fight being like, both the leg kicks of Frankie Edgar, which by the way he got away from, were key to winning, and the leg kicks of Jose Aldo, which Frankie Edgar's probably going to want to wrestle off of. Those are going to. He spotlighted this before the fight ever happened. It's not like this is like, for people who know the fight game, this was a scenario you could conceive of ahead of time, and fairly certain Jose Aldo understands the fight game.
Yeah. I give credit to Frankie's camp for just nipping this in the bud right away, saying, Mark Henry telling me, we don't care, it was my fault that we lost. And
how great is that guy?
Yeah, that guy's
takes the blame himself.
Isn't that the right answer?
Well, because I can guarantee you a lot of other coaches or managers would have been like, let's get him and all this stuff. I give him credit for not making it into a big deal. Evangelista Cyborg fractures his skull against Michael Venom Page on Saturday. I thought, by the way, that Bellator card was a very entertaining card. It's a shame that it was tape delayed and they were spoiling their own results. Our own Dave Meltzer reporting that it didn't really affect the ratings all that much, which is an even bigger shame because that means they're going to keep doing it.
That's what people always ask, why do they do it?
Yeah.
Because it works.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
But that was a hard injury to look like. I just that one hurt me right here in the head looking at that. What was your reaction when you saw the pictures, and in particular that 3D image of his skull? I mean, there is a dent in this man's skull, and then he's saying he wants to fight in 3 months, or at least his ex-wife saying
crazy.
that. What is Joe Rogan called it the worst injury he's ever seen in MMA, and I don't know if that's, I don't know. I don't even know if we need to like rank these, but what was your reaction when you saw that?
It was the worst I've ever seen, just because, I mean, obviously when you see someone's leg break, like the Anderson Silva or something, they're grotesque, but when it's your skull, I mean, just to see, it looked like his skull was caved in partly, and that's something that it just never, I mean, I've seen a million people throw, flying knees that looked more savage than the one that hit him, but you saw him immediately go down and not want to. It wasn't that he was knocked out; it was just that he couldn't move. He was in such pain and such agony, and the result of it was pretty grotesque. It was for me the most grotesque thing I've ever seen in the sport.
MVP received some criticism for his celebration, for not checking on Cyborg. Of course, he didn't know at the time the kind of injury. Is that fair?
Well, he's received that criticism anyway. Like going into this fight, people think he's a little bit too cocky in there, and he's doing these things. Honestly, it goes into his star power, the way he's been handling himself. But this particular time, obviously, he did not know that he just broke this guy's skull. And I think he had it all planned out. Obviously, he was going to do this thing afterwards, and he got the perfect opportunity. Basically a walk-off, it just knocks him out, and he did it. I didn't really have any problem with that. Of course, you look back retrospectively and you think, like, wow, what a gruesome injury, and you think, like, that was uncalled for. But that's not how it's really playing out.
Can you imagine if he went after him after the knee landed, the guy with the fractured skull, and you continue to punch him? That would be worse.
You could see that he was hurt in a way that wasn't normal from the way he was reacting. You know how sometimes a guy breaks something and you just see them, it's like a panic. There's convulsing, like panic. I could see that, and I was wondering at the time, like, oh, I wonder what happened to him. He seems like he's truly hurt, not knocked out, but truly hurt, and just knowing he took it in the face, I thought maybe his nose had caved in, or so, like more like the Rory McDonald or something like that. But man, it does make you think. It does make you pause, because I feel like we do, certainly, or at least I do. I've built up my immunities to just about everything, and blood doesn't bother me that much. You see crazy things happening all the time. Even broken limbs, you still turn away like, don't do it. But you understand, like, that's part of what happens in this sport. But to see something like that, it does make you, it makes you stand back for a minute and makes you realize what you're watching. The fight game is not a game at all. Very literal transaction between guys and dictating their will on each other.
Yeah, when you, in terms of like injuries, the Anderson Silva one's pretty bad, although that's happened in kickboxing previously, that kind of thing. In terms of like cuts, the one Vitor Belfort put on Marvin Eastman, that is an all-time. I mean, Joe Rogan goes, he looked like he got hit with an axe, which is true. He was okay, but like it was a bad laceration. But like generally, like why is MMA okay? Because there's typically a ceiling on what we allow in terms of damage to the human body, which is why, as I've been saying this whole time, two clean fighters can do serious damage to each other. What keeps a lid on that is not super aggressive PED testing. What keeps a lid on that is really controlled officiating. Big John, I believe, was a referee in that one, right? And he saw it immediately as soon as he saw him writhing and stepped in, and other referees would have been capable of that. But the other part about what makes MMA okay is that we can put a tempest in the teapot, but you think to yourself, if someone got punched in the face and they just died, there's no way MMA would be a thing. It's a thing because people have resiliency to things. But this was one of those times I was like, oh my God, like if this happened routinely, you could not be in favor of MMA.
True. No.
That's true. You could not. You would say MMA has to be outlawed. It has to be. Now, if it happens one time, and to my knowledge, in a very aberrant way, not merely that it was cracked, but like the depth to which it was cracked. Like it wasn't just like you see Mark Hunt get his like jaw cracked, but it's kind of like a hairline fracture,
This was caved.
This was caved in on multiple parts of the lobe, and so my thought was, if that happens routinely, we can't do this anymore. That's how bad that was. So hopefully that's not the case, and obviously I hope he can make a great recovery.
Okay, we have to move along because we're running out of time, and we have a hard out this week. I will just say that his reaction reminded me of Brandon Vera against John Jones. Remember when he broke his over?
Too.
Yeah, and when I saw him moving his legs like that, I was like, oh, this is scary stuff. Okay, let's end on this. It's UFC on Fox 20 this Saturday. The first UFC on Fox event was November of 2011. That was the heavyweight title fight. We have a card on Saturday featuring Holly Holm, and poor Holly Holm still has to answer why she took a fight against Miesha Tate and have to explain to people her stance and defend her stance, I should say, which is just mind-blowing to me. But here we are, Holly Holm, very big star, and I think it's a very good idea to put her on Fox because it's still a pretty good platform. But here we are 20 shows later. How would you describe the state of the UFC on Fox shows. Do they still feel special to you when you see what UFC on Fox 20 is, what the next one is, what the last few have been? Because I know UFC on Fox 1 felt very special to me, and 2 felt special, and 3 felt. But does it still feel special, or does this kind of just feel like a fight night card that's on a very big platform?
Well, that's what makes it special. It's a fight card that is on a very big platform. I don't think that the UFC scheduled a card that would that's going to make anybody sit up and take notice. Really, it's really a 2-fight card this weekend, and but it is going to be on the big Fox, so it's going to naturally draw a huger audience. So that's what makes it a quote-unquote special event. But in terms of what the UFC is offering, it is really we've seen fight pass cards that have more star power than this.
I feel like these Fox cards, when they fall through from the original iteration, they sometimes look like this. This particular one is probably the worst one, let's put it that way. But there was, what was the one? Was it the Orlando one that recently occurred? There were so many fights falling out of that and so much fluctuation that you ended up with a much diminished product than the one you were supposed to get, the intention. This one was supposed to have Glover Teixeira and Anthony Johnson. It would have actually added to the depth of this card. I don't know how much. I mean, to me, that's an interesting fight, but I don't know if it would have made it like a big event or something like that. But it does feel like we're dealing more on the fumes of what somebody was recently, and you know what I mean? We're kind of mixed man. We're not necessarily getting title fights, but you're getting people who are involved in title fights or could be involved in title fight. You're getting more of the periphery that way. So it seems like they've taken like a couple logs off the fire.
Do you think that the UFC saw the early Fox shows and how many times they put DJ on those cards and Benson Henderson, and then realized that it's not necessarily translating into more pay-per-view buys, and also realized that, look, these Fox shows are bought and paid for already. We don't stand to make more money off of them from a fight pass or pay-per-view perspective, and now they're just putting like those kind of fights on. They've kind of given up the idea of building stars off Fox.
I think that's part of it. I think it's a big part of it. I think the other part is it feels like it used to be when the UFC would put out a Fox card, we would either critique it or praise it based on how much like they're taking advantage of this Fox moment. It feels like now that the UFC is in the driver's seat, that they're waiting for this next TV deal and that they're going to have a bunch of suitors, and we don't have to put out a good card or a good card on Fox this Saturday, because we know that people know if we put our stars on TV, people will watch. It's going to do $2 million and some change. We don't have to extend ourselves too far as a consequence of that, and I think that's right. I think they are going to get some suitors for the next TV deal, and so they don't have to go, let's pull from 202, let's do this, let's just put out what we have, it's good enough, we're going to be in Chicago before, and it'll be all right.
It was great when they were doing the Tony Ferguson against Nurmagomedov. That type of fight, to me, makes the most sense, because you're building a guy who's going to be that contender, and you're giving him that platform. That's the kind of fights that I felt like they were going in the direction when they were making those fights. It just seems like it's inconsistent.
Well, are you surprised, Jeff, that being on Fox hasn't translated into more stars? You can't sit and look at the roster and say, this guy was made because he fought or she fought on Fox multiple times. There isn't one. I mean, DJ fought on Fox 3 straight times, and he's still no more of a pay-per-view draw than he ever was. The same with Benson Henderson when he was in the UFC. I mean, people have repeatedly shown up on those cards. Nothing really happens. Maybe Nate Diaz, you can make the case, because they stuck him on a couple of those. Are you surprised? Because I thought it was going to translate into bigger stars.
Maybe a little bit, but it's hard, because there are different platforms even within Fox. There's the big Fox and
I'm talking big Fox.
Right, but they all sort of tie together, because that's the if you're a fan of the sport and you're not a big enough fan to buy pay-per-views, how do you get to watch the sport? Well, and you're not going to also buy the fight pass. You're going to just concentrate on what you can get for free on your.
Yeah, but I think the hope was that you put these guys on Fox and then you'll pay for them the next time, right? Mm-hmm. That was obviously what they were.
They're just like, no, I'll watch it on Fox. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll buy the next card when I want to buy the next card.
That's pretty much right.
Yeah, I think people just watch the fights. If they like the fights, they'll say, okay, I'll watch the fights next time. They're not thinking, ooh, that was the guy that I watched this time. I got to go buy the pay-per-view.
But I'm surprised that hasn't happened. Yeah. I thought that, and I think, excuse me, I think they thought, wow, I just saw this guy. When's the next time he's fighting? Oh, pay-per-view, I'll pay for him.
This tells you how much the preeminency of the UFC brand is real. Bill Simmons on his show any given Wednesday. People go around and say, hey, you want to watch UFC? They don't really say, hey, do you want to sit around and watch MLB? I think there's a portion of the fan base who's like, yeah, UFC fights, it's a reliable indicator of quality. Boop, that's it.
Is there one thing that we're excited about, one thing we're looking forward to? I feel like it's been, maybe it's just me, a lot of doom and gloom this week. Is there one good thing going on in MMA that we're happy about?
Very quickly, very simply, Darian Caldwell fights again on Friday. I am looking forward to that.
The Wolf.
Bantamweight, to your point.
Yes.
Even outside of the UFC, bantamweight's
The
super hot.
most stacked division.
I don't know about all that now, but they're certainly great. It's certainly great.
What's exciting you right now in MMA?
I don't want to diminish Holly Holm's return. I mean, I think that she did not successfully defend her title. Now she faces a challenge that is going to sneak up on her. There's a lot of people that don't know Shevchenko, and they're going to know about her this weekend. They're going to see that this is somebody that's going to meet her where she lives. It's going to be a tough fight for her. So I'm eager to see not just how Holly Holm performs, but also the aftermath. But she's successful on Saturday night. What are we going to hear right afterward? Are we going to be seeing her and Ronda Rousey at some point?
You're talking about just this weekend or in general?
No, just in general.
Derek Lewis.
Derek
That guy,
Lewis.
Man. Love that guy.
Derek Lewis is the man.
I love seeing him. I love seeing his story. We love redemption stories. He's a guy who very quietly, has a past, but he's where he's at right now, and he's kind of. I know he's on your show recently, and
Owner of a new salon.
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Wow. Should have called it the Beast, though. Whatever.
I know, right? Derek Lewis makes you happy.
Also, he's the unofficial king of Twitter, social media generally.
It's amazing.
Yeah, he's great.
Definitely.
I'll say, and I know this will piss people off, and it's a polarizing topic.
That's my bit.
Yeah, that's true. I'm sorry. I'm happy for Tyron Woodley. I like the idea that Tyron Woodley's getting a title shot. I think for the most part he's done things the right way. Clean fighter, worked his ass off. Yeah, he's had some ups and downs, and he was promised a title shot, and they stuck to it even though everyone thought it was a stupid. Tyron Woodley's getting a title shot next week. That puts a smile on my face.
Let's hope that fight happens, man. We're still a week out.
Now
so.
you end on that note. All right.
Chuck.
Yeah. We are out of time. Thank you very much for watching the show. Appreciate it. Another busy week of MMA, as Luke alluded to. Bellator back on Friday, UFC back on Saturday. Pretty much a lot of free MMA, if you want to count cable as free. I know you have to pay for Spike
I don't.
TV.
My cable bill's outrageous.
Okay, fair enough. Free MMA on Saturday, though. Live and free on Fox. All right, thank you so much for watching. For Luke, Jeff, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Appreciate your time. Enjoy the fights.